A late-night attack on a Jewish event in Washington leaves 2 dead. The diplomatic tsunami has arrived, and we'll be welcoming in a fellow Jewish podcaster. It's Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news. This podcast has been dedicated since its inception 4.5 years ago to the discussion between Israel and diaspora. I think what happened in the heart of Washington, D.C., that terrorist attack, is that story really in a nutshell. And you think of, who was targeted. And the fact that it was two staffers of the Israeli embassy in Washington leaving an event. I mean, let's pause on what this event was. It was a reception for young diplomats from 30 different countries who were invited to a panel on building bridges and helping Gaza, and connecting between the Muslim community, the Jewish community. And that is when there were shots. It's just that thought. And for Israelis, I apologize for taking that perspective just for a moment, but this happened at 3 a.m. Israel. Israelis in the central part of this country were woken up by a Houthi missile making its way in our direction. So I think many people, including myself, who were woken in the dead of night, couldn't go back to sleep and then just kept, scrolling your phone. And then an hour later, as I said, this happened. It kind of reminds you that we're all in this together. We can argue until smoke comes out of our ears if the war in Gaza should end, criticize the Israeli government, all of that. But at the end of the day, we're in this together. Yes,
I mean, and bound up together. And I think that's the point we've been making on the podcast from the start, is that in a way, the Jewish destiny, the Jewish future in diaspora and Israel's destiny and future are bound up with each other, almost whether you like it or not. And I think after October 7th, a lot of people who previously had thought they could keep these things quite separate realised they couldn't. The categories also are very porous. I mean, what's Israeli, what's Jewish? These are two staffers at the Israeli embassy. One is an American citizen. But I think a crucial point is, because you use the word targeted, I don't think we know whether the suspected killer knew who was Israeli, who was Jewish. The point is he was attacking an event organized by the American Jewish Committee at a Jewish museum. I think he was thinking he would hit a Jewish target, even as he was apparently shouting Free Palestine. So the two are completely merged in his mind, that he wants to lash out at Israel and does it by hitting a Jewish target. These categories that I think some people want to keep very distinct in their minds won't stay separate like this. The other day I was speaking actually at a synagogue community here in London at a shul, and they like many communities have been really torn over events since October the 7th, for a whole range of reactions in that community, and wanting to talk about how they can stay talking to each other. And one point I made was that I think so often when you're trying to work out who do you feel solidarity with, it's this sense that we celebrate each other's triumphs and grieve each other's tragedies, that is something that makes you part of this Jewish people. Mm-hmm. And that has come, just a few days later, here we are grieving another tragedy. Is it a diaspora tragedy? Is it an Israeli tragedy? Of course, it's both. And the two are intertwined. And I think the Jewish people is seeing more and more in recent months and years how intertwined, how inseparable these two destinies are in a way.
Yes, I mean, and we should say their names. It's Sarah Milgram and Yaron Lishinsky. Sarah, we should say or read from her LinkedIn account. She says, "My passion lies at the intersection of peace building, religious engagement, and environmental work to the best of our ability." Yaron Lishinsky was born in Israel to a Christian mother and a Jewish father. He he was the staffer at the Israeli embassy, was about to propose to her, this is a tragic story of two young lives cut way too short. But again, I return to what they were doing there in the first place, right? This was an event or a panel of Israel, which is a humanitarian organization, an NGO. And this conversation was done with the Multi-Faith Alliance to try and discuss innovative ways to rebuild Gaza. This, of course, mattered not at all to the man who came and wanted to murder young people, these people coming to this event. And it does look like what he was targeting was Jews and not specifically staffers who worked at the Israeli embassy. But as you say, I mean, we are living in a time in which people never needed, I think, a lot of reasons to hate Jews, but a lot of this has been galvanized and radicalized. And whether you think that it has to do with Israel or not necessarily has to do with Israel, definitely the volume of this, the vitriol, the violence that was already in the air. One of my friends says something so depressing to me. He said that he wasn't surprised that this happened. He was surprised that it took such a long time for this to happen. That's what he said to me, which is really a sad thought.
Yes, and the personal story is so poignant that this couple in love, the story was that he had bought a ring just a matter of days ago, that they were planning to be together, and you see these photographs of them. That has a personal poignancy, but in terms of the sort of charge this put through all diaspora communities was this sense that I think, where you're alluding to, which is we know there have been many, many attempts before now, that this was the one that succeeded. The reports here in London that he had a ring that he'd only bought a matter of days ago in order to propose to her that they wanted to spend their lives together. But I think the sense through the diaspora that, in a way, your friend is voicing is the fear that this was only a matter of time because, and it's not just some abstract anxiety, this is based on the fact that there have been thwarted plots, many of them in the period, in the 20 months since October the 7th. Just here in London last month, there was an attempt on the Israeli embassy in London. The authorities here arrested a group that they identified as an Iranian terror cell that they believed was plotting again against Jewish targets, just showing how these categories are porous. Israeli embassy, Jewish targets, but the embassies of Israel in Stockholm and Belgrade have been targeted. A teenager was arrested in Germany, planning apparently a similar kind of attack. And the heightened security, I mean, it is just a fact of life that diaspora Jews are so used to, and it always in a way shocks our neighbours when we tell them that there have to be guards outside synagogues, schools, kindergartens, any Jewish gathering. Just yesterday evening, I went to interview the author of a good new book, Jack Fairweather, author of the book called The Prosecutor, about a Jewish lawyer who prosecuted Nazi war crimes, and a fascinating story. A group of people who want to learn about history. Our bags are frisked as if it's a terror target, an event of listening to a historian. And you just take it as part of life in diaspora, if you are, in Jewish life. And so we have known this, and as you say, the feeling here is a kind of dread that this one, not that it was something out of the blue, but on the contrary, just this is the one that got through.
Yeah, and I think we should also say something about the men and the women of Israeli missions around the world, embassies, consulates. They have become targets. And these are people who are working hard. They're representing their country. In some cases, they may or may not agree with what the government policy is, but that is their role. And just to think of the fact that they have become sort of front line in these terrible events is something that's very dispiriting. I'm searching for ways to lighten the mood, and I really can't find them because we're going into, Israel and Gaza. So I apologize to our listeners this week because that's where we're heading. I guess
it is. It is. We will bring some good cheer later on in the podcast. Don't worry when we talk about our Mensch and Chutzpah Awards, and we also have a guest who grapples with exactly the issues we do of how to keep talking about this stuff and somehow keep one's spirits up. So we'll do all that. But no, this week, this phrase that was talked about often in Israel, that if X and Y and Z happen, then eventually there will be a diplomatic tsunami that will hit Israel. Well, I think it's fair to say that this week it arrived. To begin the week, the leaders of France, the United Kingdom and Canada made a sort of joint maneuver announcing that they were considering sanctions against Israel, and a huge escalation of the rhetoric. 25 Western countries issued a joint statement expressing concern over Gaza. The British government suspended talks they'd had on a free trade agreement with Israel, and 17 of the 27 EU member states voted to look again at the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which grants preferential trading arrangements to Israel. So this isn't just gesture. This will really affect the Israeli economy. There's been a whole wave of this, and the language, I think, is really worth noting. Two things I would say. You look at Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Britain, describing himself as horrified by what is going on in Gaza, very specifically the policy of denial of humanitarian aid, as it's seen outside Israel as a policy of using starvation as a weapon of war. We talked about it a lot last week on the podcast. That is where the line has been crossed in terms of many of these governments. The second related thing I was going to say is, you take someone like Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of Britain, he took a huge amount of political heat from his own side, actually, for defending Israel early on, after October 7th, for staying with them, for not calling for a ceasefire in the early phase of this war. He paid a very high political price. I say that because these are not people who are politically hostile to Israel. On the contrary, Canada, France, Britain, the others, these are allies of Israel. That's how they identify themselves. And the leaders of these countries have taken heat for not condemning Israel earlier, but the images of starving children have crossed the line in terms of public opinion and in terms of governmental judgment. And that is what triggered this diplomatic tsunami that I think we've witnessed this week.
Yes, the big question is, what does this also mean for the United States? We should say this. First of all, this was a week in which Prime Minister Netanyahu ordered an immediate return of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Under U.S. pressure, we should say there was no vote in the cabinet for this. This is his decision. For 2.5 months, food has not entered. The population depended on what was the food that already exists in the warehouses and storages, but nothing else. Since then, there have been about 100 trucks coming in a day. That is much more than nothing, but less than what is needed. And I think that the issue here right now, we should say, by the way, as we speak here, that on Sunday, this will officially become the longest war in Israel's history. The War of Independence the War of 1948 lasted 596 days. On Sunday, we will be 597 days into this war. On Wednesday, this war will be 600 days long. I doubt that anyone on October 7th thought it would take so long. Now, I think it's important to look at what the Prime Minister is saying. On Wednesday, he had a press conference for the first time in 6 months. The Israeli Prime Minister stood in front of the camera answering questions from journalists. And I think there are a few important things to say about this, but a main thing to say is that he sort of aligned himself with Smotrich, saying the war will continue until all parts of Gaza are under Israel's security control. Now, there is a big question here whether the United States will or will not sort of put its foot down and say enough is enough. I think it's really important to say that the military does not intend to conquer Gaza and does not want to conquer Gaza. So at some point or another, as this war now expands, whether it is trying to be a tactic to bring back hostages or something else, we are in an impasse when it comes to the hostages and the discussion about the end of the war. Hamas still wants a permanent ceasefire. Israel still wants a temporary ceasefire. And after the release of Idan Alexander, many hostages' families here are concerned whether or not this was, I don't want to be blunt, but was this America First, the hostage version, whether or not the United States is now, out of the game when it comes to the release of the rest of the hostages, or do we have some sort of hostage deal on the horizon.
So I want to go back to where you began with the humanitarian aid and this announcement that Israel was now lifting the blockade. On the first day, I think it was 5 trucks. After then, it's bigger. The
93 and then 100.
Discussed is much higher. People on the ground saying it's still not actually reaching the people it needs to reach, but more importantly, the number is so fractionally small. It is way less than the number that is needed. So UNICEF saying that more than 9,000 children are now being treated for malnutrition in Gaza. The authorities there saying some children have already died. The official way that the Prime Minister of Israel presents this is that we've got to do this because for sort of optics and public relations reasons. I think he said words to that effect this week. It's not having that effect. It's not enough. They have to absolutely open the floodgates to aid. If the desire is to make the world's revulsion at what it has witnessed these last few weeks. It's beyond 80 days that the blockade held. So this is actually seen as, if anything, sort of almost tantalizing that some aid comes in, but it's not enough. Make the decision, feed the people there, end this starvation. That's the demand that's coming, and just sort of dithering around with these low numbers. It's actually almost, as I say, it's a kind of taunting. I think it's people are really demanding something else. As you say, I think all eyes are on Washington. So there's this diplomatic tsunami out of the likes of Paris or Ottawa or London. But the phone call that everyone believes makes a difference is from the American president. And there are reports that he himself is, distressed, that he wants this wrapped up. It's funny, it's the word I think I used on the podcast last week. And actually, that's the word language now being briefed out, that he just wants this wrapped up. And he's thinking that he was in the region last week, saw as he thinks, the future, the possibility of prosperity and trade deals with these various autocratic regimes he likes. And he thinks the one sort of trouble spot still is Gaza, and just wants this cleaned up. And yet, has he made that phone call in which he says to Netanyahu, more or less, you must do this and must do it now? I don't think he has. But that's the thing I think that would be the game changer here. As for the talks, I mean, we've been here round and round and round until we actually, this is one of those things, we're not going to see it until we believe it. The political logic remains what it has been at least since July of last year. Netanyahu wants this war to continue. He does not mind the suffering. He just needs his coalition to stay intact, because that's how he stays out of jail and keeps his job. Sorry to put it so baldly, but while the rest of the world is banging the table and really appalled by what they're seeing, that's where he is.
Yeah, I think we should just make a note of the fact that one thing that did happen this week is that UN aid chief claimed that 14,000 Gazan babies would die in 48 hours without aid. Then the UN had to retract that. So I think there's also, in this environment of this conversation, I think it's also important to be sort of factual based and not anything else. You mentioned
yes, I mean, I think sorry, I was just going to say, obviously right, he shouldn't have said that. I think the issue was the timeline, because he said in 48 hours this is going to happen, and when the walkback said this is the projection for a year if the current blockade were to continue. So obviously there are worlds apart there, but if you continue not feeding an area for a year, and it'd been 80 days, then babies are going to die. So
we agree that there's a difference between 2 days and a year.
Look, obviously this UN official shouldn't have put it the way he did, and shouldn't have said something that was untrue like that. But if you're getting into an argument, if particularly, spokespeople for Israel are getting into arguments where they're saying, if we continued killing at this rate, it wouldn't achieve this number of dead babies in 2 days, it would achieve it in 12 months. That's a bad argument to be getting into. Israel shouldn't be in the business where its policy of a humanitarian blockade is going to end up with children being killed. And if it's arguing about how quickly that is going to result in, the huge numbers of child deaths, it's losing. That's not an argument it should be getting into. Obviously, Fletcher wrong about the numbers, but that, once that's the argument and once that's the debate, it's a place Israel should not be. And as I said last week, this all should be morally unthinkable to be using a policy of starvation.
So let's just say this. Israel didn't go into this war, and it's not fighting this war to kill Palestinian babies. I don't think anyone thinks that is, or at least anyone with a rationale and a conscience thinks that is the case. If you, as the top UN aid chief, claim that 14,000 Gazan babies will die within 48 hours, and your way to retract that is not to apologize, but to say, oh, it's my mistake. We actually meant over a year. So this is a hypothetical, and the damage and the delegitimization you just added to by saying that, I think, is irresponsible. So it doesn't, I think, help to say, oh, but he actually meant over a year. It doesn't matter. You shouldn't say inaccurate things in a case that is so serious. And we all agree, and by the way, as we said last week and this week, of the urgency to solve this very, very quickly.
Just in terms of delegitimization, who do we think is delegitimizing Israel right now? Tom Fletcher or the government of Israel, which is pursuing a policy of humanitarian blockade?
So just as an answer to that question, could it be both? Does it have to be mutually exclusive?
No, but it's just, we always say delegitimization is this person for saying this person for saying that. What about the actual actions of a government who is, overtly, Minister of Defense says, it's a weapon. We are going to use this to pressure Hamas, starvation. Mm-hmm. And that's the delegitimization, in my view. We're not going to resolve it because we've talked about it so often for many, many months. This is the latest iteration of that conversation.
I think that it's very important to note something else that happened in the press conference yesterday, because Netanyahu refused actually to answer. This was a reporter, my colleague, Yaron Avraham, on Channel 12, who asked him, would he postpone elections if the war continued? Now, we'll remind our listeners, elections are slated for October 2026. No one in the political arena in Israel thinks they will actually happen then, but they will probably be earlier. And he kind of started, just to sort of give the context here, Netanyahu said to the journalists that he thinks that are mainstream media and against him, he said, you want elections now because you think we'll lose, and we can't do elections when there's a war. That's what Netanyahu said. Then he was asked, so if the war continues, will you postpone elections? And he refused to say that he won't. So I think that's a point to be made about where the sort of mindset of this coalition is. Israel also, I think, was quite embroiled in a statement that was said this week by the head of the Israeli left, which was once the Labor Party, now is Labor and Meretz. It's Yair Golan. He said that a sane country does not fight against civilians, does not kill babies as a hobby, and does not give itself the aim of expelling populations. Of course, an outrage and outcry. He was criticized by everyone, but particularly the Likud, pointing, we should say that's pretty bad use of words. The word hobby here is perhaps an issue. And then he had to sort of explain himself, say, I didn't mean the military, I meant the policy of this government. But now, this morning, as of the events in Washington unfolding, everyone in Netanyahu's coalition blaming Yair Golan for what he said, saying this gave legitimacy to the people who hate Israel to go to this shooting.
Yeah, they went to that very, very quickly. I mean, I think the likelihood...
Instantly, one should say.
Instantly. The likelihood that the shooter in Washington had listened to the words of opposition party leader Yair Golan, and that's what put him over the edge. It seems very cheap and cynical to me to immediately try and score a political point out of these horrible events. I mean, obviously Yair Golan should not have spoken in the terms and in the words that he did. I think, though, the demand to say and to voice and force Israelis to confront the consequences of what's happened in Gaza, I sort of get the impulse. I see why he felt the need to do it. His wording was, very, very counterproductive and has probably damaged him. And that's a great shame, I think. But that need to sort of address the Israeli public and say, look what this looks like outside. I really do have admiration for him for doing that. Because I do think there is partly a disconnect. I think some of this, diplomatic stuff comes as a shock to many Israelis because I think they don't fully know how this looks on the outside and what the rest of the world sees. I mean, a long time ago, you said, I think it was when we had Ilana Dayan on the podcast, we are not seeing what you're seeing. And that's true. But in a way, it does take somebody. And I think, Golani's a courageous figure, really, throughout his career, including on October the 7th, when he was one of the heroes of October the 7th, leaping in his car and going to rescue people, donning his uniform in his 60s. He's a courageous figure, and he wants to tell people what's going on. I think sometimes his mouth lets him down, and he needs to word things more carefully. We should remember he was the deputy chief of staff of the IDF until he again spoke in, over-the-top terms at a Memorial Day event, apparently drawing a parallel with the events of the 1930s and 40s. So he needs to guard that. And yet maybe part of his appeal as a political leader is that he doesn't watch what he says so carefully. We know that can work quite well for some politicians around the world who shoot their mouth off. And some people see in it a kind of authenticity. But the emotional impulse which drove him, which is a kind of wake up, look what's going on, I think I understand that.
Yeah, and one could make the argument that when there are ministers in the actual government, Ben-Gvir is saying you should flatten Gaza and attack the food warehouses, when Smotrich says that Gaza should be totally destroyed, when an MK from Ben-Gvir's party says you can kill 100 Gazans a day and no one is interested in that, one would say maybe that, garners more headline than when someone from the opposition says. I would say, just as an Israeli, it would be a refreshing thing if people would stop, politicians in general would just stop talking so much and doing more, and maybe that would be helpful a little bit. I would want to make one more note about the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, and that sort of question whether or not Trump will essentially force Israel to end the war, force Netanyahu to end the war. It's very clear that something in that connection between the two countries is different than it was in the Trump, in his first tenure in the White House. Then you had the POC, the point of contact. You had Dermer. You had talking directly to Kushner, everything there, to say nothing of some of the speeches that really sounded, Trump's speeches, it sounded like Dermer himself phrased them. This is a different world. And I think one of the things to notice with that story coming out about Waltz being fired because of, and notice the sort of leak, because of his close relationship to Dermer, that was a sign, that was a signal, I think, to more than anyone, to Marco Rubio, to say, listen, you don't need to have too close relationships with Israel because some of our interests don't align. And I think that we should notice that gap. There's always this line that American officials used to say, and Israeli officials used to say, there's no daylight between us. Netanyahu went very far in the press conference yesterday to say there's no daylight. There does seem to be a whole lot of daylight. And that is something to watch very, very closely.
Yeah, and I think we talked about it last week after the trip. That daylight became even more visible as you saw Trump seeing his interests tied up with these sort of Gulf autocrats who he can really do business with, and Israel seeing it very, very differently. I think the only question is, does it hold? Because with Trump, there can be sort of mood swings and things turn another way in a week's time, 2 weeks' time, a few hours' time. But as it stands, there's definitely a clear divergence of interest. And, I think those people who want this war to end and want for one thing, the hostages back home and for this humanitarian crisis to be lifted, they have to now be rooting for Donald Trump to see his interests as different from Netanyahu's and to pick up the phone and say enough's enough and to care. Yeah, I mean, that's a commodity in short supply among some of these political leaders, I think.
True.
Well, we wrestle, don't we, you and I, every week with how to convey all this stuff, how to talk about it without making people want to, switch over and just listen to pop music. And so we thought it would be great to speak with somebody else who often feels the same, is often doing the same, and does it extremely successfully.
Jonah Platt is the host of the podcast Being Jewish with Jonah Platt, which deals with Jewish identity. He's an actor, producer, and advocate. He comes from entertainment. His voice has become increasingly influential around issues of Jewish identity and anti-Semitism in the U.S. Jonah, thank you so much for coming on Unholy.
Thank you both for having me. Pleasure to be here, all around the world.
Yeah, and it really is, right? Between LA and London and Tel Aviv, we really are. We managed to somehow synchronize our time zones. We're speaking here in the shadow of what happened in D.C. It's about 12 hours after as we sit here. Could you share with us just your initial sort of thoughts, feelings after this happened?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the initial thought is sadness and just taking in the tragedy of two young, engaged people standing outside of a building and getting killed for it. It's just devastating. And, the next thing is, relief that everybody inside that building was all right. I mean, the fact that the shooter walked into the building afterwards and for whatever reason didn't try anything in there is a blessing. I mean, that's like bench and Gomel worthy. So I definitely thought about that. This is, it's funny. I posted yesterday about blood libel on Instagram. I made an infographic about how the sort of Hamas communications cycle works of the fabricating data, the UN parroting it, the media hurrying to pick it up, the anti-Israel crowd throwing it all over social media, and Hamas saying, okay, this works, I'm going to keep doing it. And then, not 8 hours later, somebody shouting free, free Palestine shot up two Jews in front of a Jewish museum in the capital of this country. It's hard not to think of there being a level of causality there, that when, you essentially advocate for violence against Jews, we can't be surprised when somebody takes that to heart and commits violence against Jews. And I know what the reaction's going to be from a lot of that crowd, which is, that's not me, that's not my advocacy, that's not how I feel about Palestine. When I say free Palestine, I'm certainly not advocating for violence. And of course that's fair and true, but the fact remains that there is a dark, violent element of this movement. And when you shout free Palestine as a justification for violence, that's not protest anymore, that's persecution. And that's what we're seeing. And I really hope that everybody who needs to take this seriously, that is law enforcement and government, really do take this extremely seriously to ensure that there's not a cluster effect here or contagion effect, and that this is a one and done for our community.
How much were you surprised by it when you heard about it?
I mean, is anybody surprised anymore at anything? I wouldn't say that I'm that surprised. I guess, if anything, I would be surprised at the laxity of the security protocols at that building. It seemed like, and from what I understood, and I spoke to some people who were inside the event, that this was towards the end of the event. So that's when people tend to relax a little bit, and where the in and out of that building was a little too casual. Maybe you let your guard down a little bit because you've reached the end of the night. But hopefully this is a good wake-up call for all Jewish institutions everywhere at every level to really tighten the screws if they haven't already on security protocols. Because look, we know we need them. This part isn't new. All our synagogues have armed guards and bulletproof glass and concrete barriers and all those things. And if they don't have them, they should have them. And I don't say that to fearmonger or to panic or to blow this out of proportion, but we know this kind of thing has happened before, famously. In the past, it's generally been hatred from the right who have been perpetuating this violence. Now it's coming from the left. It's coming from, socialists and the Free Palestine crowd. And so we just need to continue to invest in community security and tighten those screws. And I don't think anybody should be surprised that this happened, and I don't want anybody to be caught by surprise again in the future.
Obviously there's the connection to October 7th and the anti-Israel crowd, which is galvanized and in some cases radicalized. But it does feel like beyond that, and particularly, after October 7th, that Jew hatred is tolerated. I don't want to say open season on the Jews, but it does kind of feel like that. There's a famous artist singing Heil Hitler. There's, a million examples. Tucker Carlson saying the Jews killed Kennedy. It's coming from the left. It's coming from the right. It's coming from entertainment. It's coming from politics. What can be done?
Well, when you put it like that, it's pretty dark situation. But look,
Greg
there's always
convinced me
work
that I'm wrong.
there's always work to be done, and I think the best sort of antidote to what we're seeing is not like, let's fight and combat anti-Jew bigotry. We obviously have to be calling those things out and taking them seriously, and that's a piece of the puzzle. But to me, the best antidote is creating a loud and proud Jewish community and allies that are really taking up space in public in a way that we have not in this country before, where we've always sort of apologized for being here or kept our heads down. And as much as the hatred of Jews is being normalized, we need to normalize Jews being part of this country and part of the West in an open, public, respected, dignified way, and not in a self-deprecating, deferential, is it all right with you kind of way. To me, that's the most important thing. That and what comes with that, but is also sort of its own thing, is education. So much of the ability to hate on Jews comes from lies and misunderstandings. And once somebody has been incepted by these lies and misunderstandings, it's really hard to undo. So if we can pour our energy into focusing on getting to people's brains before the propaganda does, I think that will go a really long way. And some of those key misunderstandings are, for example, like what a Jew is. Most people on planet Earth have no idea what a Jew is. They think a Jew is whatever they see on the news, which is people who blow up babies. And they think a Jew is whatever they see in movies on TV, which is like ultra-Orthodox diamond dealers and rich white people in Beverly Hills. Like, those are Jews. They don't know that Jews are a people, that a tribe stretching back to thousands of years, for which religion is but one shared facet of this people. They don't know that Jews come in all colors and from all over the world, but are all still that same tribe, and that, in fact, the majority of the world's Jews are not even white presenting. They don't know that Jews, there are as many poor Jews as rich Jews in America. Just understanding those points, I think, would go a long way towards mitigating a lot of this hatred, because it's much harder to call somebody a rich white European colonizer when you know that they are, a poor brown Iraqi refugee. Or whatnot, there's just so much more to us than that very overly simplistic binary that is purposefully being pushed forth to, kind of whitewash us and make us hateable.
Very interesting what you're saying. And I think we wrestle with a lot of this stuff. Here's something I myself don't know the answer to. So this is why I would really like to hear your view of it.
Sure.
We all agree that somebody who's opening fire on a Jewish museum is an anti-Semite, right? It doesn't matter what slogan they chant. If you're firing on a synagogue or a Jewish museum, you're a Jew hater, you're an anti-Semite. Okay.
Right. Period.
Period, exactly. What does it do, though, to how Jews are seen outside the realm of those extremes and those kind of unconscionable acts, to just how Jews are seen when the most visible Jewish society in the world, which is Israel, behaves in ways which liberal people who are not haters, but just decent liberal people who don't like, for example, this Yonit will groan because I bang on about this all the time, but they don't like famines when they're in Africa. They don't love seeing people being hungry in Gaza, right?
Yep.
And they see a Jewish government doing that. What does it do to people's views of Jews in America when that's happening, if anything? Or is it just totally separate and one doesn't have any bearing on the other?
Well, it shouldn't have any bearing on the other, but I think we all know that it does. I think there's this, unfair, what I would call bigoted assumption that because you're a Jew and because you thusly may support, the existence of the Jewish homeland and the people in that homeland, that means you automatically agree with everything the government is doing, which is an insane double standard that no one else on earth has to deal with at either level. Nobody in their own country has to deal with that because you're a citizen of that country, you must agree with absolutely everything that country does at all times. And certainly nobody holds to that standard people who don't even live in that country. So it's extremely unfair, but it sort of is the situation where we're at, where there's a little bit of, and I sort of get where it comes from, right? Because I am a Jew, I do support Israel. So if you don't know about Jews, you don't understand the connection to Israel. And for you, this Israel thing is, political dinner table conversation that you can pick up and put down. There's this assumption that that's sort of what it is for me. And I could just choose to say, I can't stand with this country. But, we're family. And you don't go against the family in a meaningful way. You call out your family, you criticize your family, you fight with your family, you urge them and push them and hold them accountable. But you don't turn on them. You work with it. You got to figure it out. You only get one family. And that's certainly how I feel about Israel. And that's why it's tricky. And I always am urging people to not paint the anti-Israel crowd all with the same brush. Very much, Jonathan, for how you just painted them. There are plenty of people who they don't know the whole situation. They don't know the context. They don't know the nuance. All they know is they're seeing, completely starving children on their Instagram feed. And from their point of view and from what they're being shown, it's completely Israel's fault. And they want it to go away and they want it to stop. And they want the entity that they feel is responsible to be held accountable. And if you're supporting that entity, that's to them some level of complicity in that, which is complicated and unfair. And one of those things that unless we talk about it and talk about it together, we're just going to keep missing each other. And it's just going to create this deep misunderstanding and discord.
I wonder about, the sort of generational difference. And you know what? Let's talk about that a little bit, but then I'm also interested in your family, and I assume that there are some disagreements within that family. If there's something called a royal Jewish family in America, that's probably the family you come from, but we'll get to that.
Oh my gosh.
I'm wondering, is it possible to say there's a royal Jewish family?
I don't know about that.
But we should say your father is Marc Platt. He's a big-time Hollywood producer. Your mother is Julie Platt of the Jewish Federations, and everyone there knows her. And your brother is famous actor Ben Platt. I would assume that your views on Israel are a little different from his. It's pretty much, what we call in Israel, Meidah Galui. This is all out in the open. I wonder what your Shabbat dinners then look like.
Well, without going too much into the personal and relationship stuff, which I don't love to do, I will say it's very much what I just said in that we have to just talk to each other. And also you don't go against the family, right? I mean, family is family and that comes first. And whatever else there is, if the most important thing to you is the relationship, and certainly it is for me, you find a way to talk about it and come and understand each other. Nothing gets solved by shutting down and not communicating. Certainly that doesn't make anything better, and that doesn't help anybody. And as long as there's a mutual love and respect and the relationship comes first, I think anybody can get through any disagreement. And, my ethos, both on my show and in real life, is I'm not setting out every day to change people's minds. I think that's sort of a losing exercise, and it's not something I've personally had a lot of success with or seen other people have a lot of success with. To me, the best thing you can hope for is open dialogue and an intimate, well-functioning relationship that leaves space for conversation and ideas being shared. And that's sort of the best you can do. And then it's sort of up to the person in their own brain to take what's being put out and do with it what they will. But we don't have the power to stick our hands into somebody's brain and move things around. And when we try to do that, we risk jeopardizing the relationship. Because nobody likes to sort of be told, you're wrong, I'm right, here's why. It's just that's not a gateway to productivity.
I was just thinking that, and yet there are, and we hear about them all the time, and I'm sure you do, so many families in America certainly, but also outside, where they're just not managing to do this. I mean, that they would be really envious of your family, which is managing to contain the arguments. And instead, people, we hear about them, where kids are not speaking to their parents, parents are not having, Seder with their own, since October 7th particularly, that this is really tearing people apart. What do you think explains that? Why are some families not able to do it, some people not able to do what I think you very eloquently have described as being the goal? Why are people not able to get there?
Because emotions are a powerful thing. And when we lead with emotion, which is for many, if not most people, our instinct, it's really hard to have these kind of conversations, these difficult conversations that are scary for a lot of people to even approach. I totally get that. That's very natural. But one of the key things to having one of these kinds of difficult conversations, I actually have a thing I call the 4 C's of having difficult conversations. And one of them is calm. You have to come into it dispassionately. If you come in out of fear or anger or shame or trying to change your mind or any of that stuff, it's just going to be too fraught and too heated to work. You have to find a way. For me, what works is I like doing these kinds of conversations later at night when it's quiet and calm. I like doing them over a bottle of wine where we're chilling, where there's one of the other C's is camaraderie, right? It has to feel like we are engaging as people who have a relationship and not as debaters on opposite sides of some academic argument. Since we're on the subject, I'll say the other C's. One of them is curiosity. You have to actually want to understand what the other person is thinking and feeling. That is the key. And it's understanding that leads to good feelings at the very least, and open pathways. You might not agree, but if at least you can understand where someone is coming from, it does a lot to mitigate the bad feelings and the tension. And the rest you can work on. And then the 4th C is compassion. Not just, being curious about what they're doing, but really taking it in and going, okay, I get that. Yeah, it's not what my lived experience has taken me. It's not what I would be doing. And I still think you're missing something here. But I get how for you in your world, in your lived experience, I can see the path that brought you here, and I understand your challenges and priorities that are different than mine. And having that level of understanding in this way is the only way that I have found, at least, to be productive and to maintain healthy relationships when there are very difficult, fraught tensions like this.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting what you're saying, because obviously our conversation, Jonathan and my conversation since October 7th has been occasionally fraught with some disagreements, more than before October 7th. And I think I don't want to ruin the C's because I like them a lot, but I would say in our regard, it would be probably trust and respect. And the fact that you really trust the person you're talking to and you respect them, and you can, and I really, I can tap into what you're saying about compassion, trying to understand where the other side is coming from and what they're seeing, a little bit like in a good novel where you can put yourself in the shoes of another character. I do wonder, though, when you about this podcast, about being Jewish and the conversations, which are really interesting. But are you concerned that this also could be a sort of circle? Because people who come to the podcast would probably not be anti-Israel. That's my guess. So how do you feel that you can reach over that divide in the conversations that you do?
Yeah, it's tricky. I would say that that's not my number one goal, is reaching people who are anti-Israel or anti-Jewish. My main audience and my goal is everybody else. People who are either already pro-Israel or pro-Jewish, or at the very least are not anti and want to learn more. That's my audience. So I know I have a lot of non-Jewish people in my audience who come to the show for education and for sort of a lighter feeling around this space than some of the doom and gloom stuff, and are also interested to hear these conversations with notable people and see what they're all going through. And that's sort of my one baseline when people ask, how do you decide your guests? The only baseline I've had up until this point that unites everybody is they all like Jews. You have to like Jews to come on the show. That's the only thing. You can have different opinions on everything else, but that one, I'm not trying to bring somebody on to argue about our existence. That's not my program. Other people can do that, but that's not what this is for. And so my hope is that, when I do try to speak to those people who may need to hear a particular message about being anti-Israel or whatnot, my hope is that my audience will be sharing it with the people in their lives, or absorbing it and then going out and trying to have these conversations on their own with the people in their lives. I'm about to release on Tuesday, in my next episode, my opening monologue. I open every episode with, a 5 to 10 minute just me talking to camera about something. And it's actually about this exact subject. It's about a certain kind of anti-Israel Jew, which has been very fascinating to me, just sort of from a academic standpoint of, who are these people? Where are they coming from? How did they get there? How do we deal with them? And so I sort of go into quite a long observation about a certain class of anti-Israel Jew. And I'm hopeful that the people in these people's lives will share this with them and share the compassionate point of view that I have and understanding, and see that I'm advocating for them not to be lumped in with, keffiyeh wearing, Hamas flag bearing, anti-Western, anarchists, because that's not everybody.
I think the Israeli part of our audience will probably be interested in the fact that you went viral recently, your comments against Rachel Ziegler, who played Snow White, and promoted the movie with the words "Free Palestine," and you wrote, among other things, that free speech doesn't mean you're allowed to say whatever you want. Tens of thousands of people worked on that film. She hijacked the conversation for her own immature desires. So, I guess what I'm asking, to go beyond the film and the effects of this, but how worried are you about sort of anti-Semitism in Hollywood as a problem? Does that concern you more than, for example, what you saw on campuses?
I would say they're different. What you see on campuses is worrisome because it is physical. I mean, it is in your day-to-day life, in your face. People are being harassed physically and spat on and prevented from going into buildings and being ostracized. And so, I mean, even as I hear myself saying it, yeah, it's definitely worse for those college kids. But the impact of what Hollywood can do is obviously of a much greater scale. And so it's important to deal with what's there. There is obviously some issues with the way Jews are treated and thought of within Hollywood, but there's also really strong pro-Jewish forces in Hollywood who very much so have woken up since October 7th. I've been very encouraged by what I've seen in a lot of ways, a Jewish renaissance, if you will, of people really focusing on wanting to tell Jewish stories and hire Jewish representation for Jewish stories, and a real acknowledgement by people behind the scenes, like managers and executives and studios, all of that stuff, that there's an issue and that we can't just sort of coast quietly like we had been. There needs to be intention and activity and engagement on this stuff, and we're definitely seeing a lot more of that. And when it comes to, again, a lot of it, it's like, entertainers, their job is not to be well-versed in complex geopolitical situations. It's only because it's the thing du jour, and they all have these platforms that they're having to open their mouths about it. And in the worlds that they're in, these progressive, far to the left circles, they're in the majority. I mean, this is the pervading thought and way of seeing the world in their groups. So when they speak out about this stuff, it's very comfortable in a way to do so, and they get a lot of pats on the back for it. And I think we're quick to be like, oh, it's an echo chamber and they're just in it for the likes and the clicks. But another way, honestly, to say echo chamber is your community or your friend group. I mean, that's who's in the echo chamber with you. And when all your friends or your community think and feel a certain way, you're not necessarily a sheep for also thinking and feeling that way. That's sort of what communities get built around, are people who are like you and think like you and like the same things as you. So I think it's tough, but I do think a lot of it is not nefarious in that way. I think so much of it just comes from total misunderstanding and miseducation, and definitely a little bit of, that sort of white guilt apologism, at least coming from some of the Jews within Hollywood who feel like, they need to align with the quote unquote oppressed in a way that is somewhat performative and does speak to something deeper inside them that they're not aware of, perhaps. But I don't think a lot of it comes from, we hate the Jews, like the Jews are running things, blah, 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 that stuff. I don't see a ton of that kind of vibe.
At that point you make about sort of the echo chamber and people being surrounded by and their friends and their social circle, of course that will be true of the pro-Israel conversation as well, where people are mutually reinforcing and doubling down on what people think. I'm just, this may be related actually, and is the extent to which this has affected you. You're an actor, and I wondered, as soon as I saw your podcast, I thought, well, I wonder what that's going to do for his career. Like, being an actor in Hollywood who presents a podcast called Being Jewish helps, hurts, has no effect. What do you think? What's your sense of whether people think, maybe a bit too Jewish, let's go for someone else?
Yeah, it's a complicated question for me to answer personally, because I have made this world so much more my focus, at least at the moment, than acting. So there's a little bit of a chicken and an egg. Like, if it was affecting me, I don't know that I would necessarily feel it, because I'm focused on this work right now anyway. But I haven't felt it, to be honest. Like, I don't know if there's some conversation in some room happening that I'm unaware of, but it's not like, my auditions went away or I've had anybody say anything to me specifically. If anything, what it's done is, connected me with more people and brought more Jews within the industry into contact with me who are saying, I appreciate what you're doing and, want to be in conversation and relationship with me in solidarity, and are sort of grateful that I'm an outspoken person in the space. So I think, if anything, it's a net positive. And I do think, look, even if it wasn't, it's just too important to really worry about. This is the time to use whatever platform we have to do what we got to do, whether it's, helps the bottom line or not. And I will say, to a person, everybody on my podcast who I've asked this to has said that even when one door has maybe closed, like 10 more have opened because of this. Mm-hmm. People just sort of waiting to go, oh, you're one of us. You're one of the people out there. I can't wait to support you and help you and work on this thing with you. And I've seen all kinds of new partnerships and discoveries as a result. So I think that's one of the big fears I know people have, of like stepping into the spotlight in this way, or certainly from the outside looking in. And I would say that for the most part, it's unfounded. And even when it does take place, the pros far outweigh the cons.
So finally, I feel like I was the voice of doom and gloom in this conversation. Could have something to do with being woken up by a Houthi missile at 3 a.m. So give us something, convince us that there's some, good things about this around. Give us some optimism.
Sure. I'll give you some optimism in two ways. One is that, as I've sort of touched on a little bit in this talk, there has been a Jewish renaissance and an engagement that we haven't seen in a really long time, in a beautiful way. And I think that it's already paying dividends. I know it can feel hard to see because there's so much else going on, but it's happening already, that people are creating new initiatives and making new inroads and creating more dignity and pride in being Jewish. And that's only going to continue to grow. I'm really encouraged by what I'm seeing from the younger generation, from leaders on college campuses who are absolutely amazing and are not just leading students and are not just going to be leaders for the future, but are real leaders in this space right now and are really understanding this at a ground level and have developed like a real level of expertise around Jewish advocacy and education and anti-Jew bigotry, and are really give me a lot of hope. And then the last thing that I'll say that we always tend to forget, because it's two sides of the same coin, Jews are one of, if not the most persecuted people in history, but we're also the most resilient people in history. We are the ones who have survived all this persecution. We always do, no matter how horrible it is. We've been through way worse than what we're going through right now. We made it through that. We're absolutely going to make it through this. And as long as we continue to learn from our past, which Jews, for the most part, are pretty good at doing, of all people, we do look back on our history and try to take lessons from it. As long as we continue to do that and continue to innovate and stick together, I know we're going to be just fine.
In a way that you've answered what is a question that I know that we both sort of grapple with a lot, which is how to talk about all this stuff going on and yet still, make an entertaining experience for people listening. You don't want them jumping off a building. And so you've, in a way, I think you've answered that just with those thoughts about resilience and about the future. We are very grateful to you for coming on Unholy. Thank you, Jonah Platt.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be with you both.
Well, very good to hear from Jonah Platt. I mean, we didn't massively make a huge deal of the generational difference, but he is younger. He is speaking to young American Jews, I think, in big numbers. And I think that point he made about, that one way or another, your family, you've got to keep the conversation going and keep those channels of dialogue open. I think it's, he's obviously in his own way is doing that. And look, it's something we have been adamant about doing on here. So I think, and by the way, that point he made about sort of confidence and pride, that if Jews are kind of themselves comfortable in their own skins, then people do respond to that. And I've long thought that, and I found that resonated with me when he said that.
Yeah, I was thinking about you because we talk a lot about how the difference between the Jewish community in the United States and in the and Britain, and the difference between, he's saying that Jewish Americans need to be loud and proud. I was thinking to myself, well, perhaps louder and prouder, because they do have that kind of let's say a higher volume than the community in the UK. And I think it's an interesting difference, but I also kind of, noted that. I also like what he said about, getting to people before they are brainwashed, which is a difficult thing to do, definitely in the age of social media. But perhaps the main thing, I think, because of it's very clear that there are different views in his own family. I think, we are a family, and this podcast that we do in a way is a big family or a big tent. And I think that is the most important thing, to continue to talk, even if you're, if you disagree and even if you're upset. And, that is what we try to do, I think. It
is quite true. Really? We disagree occasionally? You'll make it, I've had no
Not
idea.
In this episode, but occasionally. I
think even in this episode. So we should give out our awards. And I think you have a nominee in the chutzpah category.
I don't know if this really is under the slate of chutzpah or a little bit more, but this is the story coming out from your neck of the woods. Gary Lineker, who's, obviously BBC's highest paid presenter, former footballer, beloved by many, shared an Instagram story on Zionism that included an image of a rat. He then apologized. He said it was a genuine mistake. He decided to essentially resign. This was about to happen. He pushed it forward. I mean, look, I think there are two things to say here. One is, for someone who prides himself in knowing the immigration policy of the former government in the UK and comparing what, former Home Secretary has said to the rhetoric in 1930s Germany, your history, apparently, you, Gary Lineker. And to say that it was a genuine mistake to post an image of a rat while discussing Zionism, I mean, look, a genuine mistake is me leaving the lasagna out at night and, letting it spoil because I was preoccupied. That's a genuine mistake and a true story. But I'm not sure that this is a genuine mistake. Obviously, he's been very, very critical of Israel throughout the war. He couldn't have not known what this image is. I think it's, a lot about social media and the way these personalities feel like they need to talk about everything that is going on. And sometimes you feel like saying, just stay in your lane and talk about what is your expertise. The sad thing at the end of the day is that for many people, someone they loved will disappear, and you know who they will blame for this at the end of the day. But again, just going back to the original story, I think he shouldn't have done it. And I do still raise questions when it comes to a genuine mistake in this regard.
Yeah, it's worth looking at the original post. It's not a giant image of a rat. It's just this rat image is there. But I think this goes to this
top of the picture, Johnny.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's. I'm not making any kind of defense of it. I just wondered if people are picturing some giant sort of, fleshy rat in the image. The thing I was just going to say about it is this porousness. Because once you are imbibing, and this was really high-strength anti-Zionist propaganda, the actual video, the barriers are down, your defences are down, and in comes anti-Semitism with it. There's so much anti-Zionist or anti-Israel rhetoric that just shades into, draws on, taps into anti-Semitic imagery, language, iconography. It just happens so often that people who thought they were there for the anti-Zionism, as it were, suddenly find that they're, leaving with a goodie bag full of anti-Semitism. And this happens a lot because these categories are porous. And like I said, actually, in a very different context at the start of the podcast, people think these things are very neat and separable. No, I'm only anti-Israel. I've got no problem with Jews. They are not that distinct, these things. Israel is the largest Jewish community in the world. And therefore, if you're attacking Israel, you are often going to find yourself, maybe just at the mildest, in some uncomfortable company. And you end up with your defences being down. Let's be that as forgiving as we can, so that this anti-Semitism has just made it through. And it's really egregious anti-Semitism. And as you say, there's nothing here to there's no one who thinks, oh, good, he's now out, because, as you say, guess who will be blamed for the departure of a much-loved broadcaster. Just before we get to our, mensch category, I was just going to mention a shout-out to the band Oi Vavoy, who, again, are absolutely in the zone. They're a brilliant band.
Good band name. Great band name. They've been around for years. They play a mixture of sort of world music. It draws on kind of klezmer and Jewish music, but also Israeli music. They've just returned from a tour where they did shows in Turkey, Budapest, Holland, Belgium. They were about to play in Bristol, a city here in the UK, as part of their UK tour to launch their new album, The Water's Edge. And at the last moment, the gig was cancelled. They say, the band, that this was under pressure from various pro-Palestinian groups who disliked what they thought were Oi Vavoy's links to Israel. I make the point that just, again, these things merge in. You think you're taking a stand against Israel, you end up essentially cancelling a Jewish band playing Jewish music and, with a lot of history of influences, Yiddish music, Ladino music, a whole lot of stuff is in Oi Vavoy's music. If you're if you think these categories are constantly separate and hermetically sealed from each other, think again. Okay, so Chutzpah Award for whoever it was who banned Oi Vavoy alongside your choice. And I think you're going to take us through with the Mensch nominations. Should consider the title Oi Vavoy for this podcast. Perhaps too Jewish, but still a good name. It's a good name. We can still do that.
That I'm not going to forget. Too Jewish, says Yonit. Okay, we'll remember that one.
Perhaps too Jewish, end quote. Mensch Award, I think, should be bestowed upon Margit Friedlander. She is someone who has become, she died last week at the age of 103, a Holocaust survivor who dedicated her life to teach and to talk about her experience and what happened to her. She was born in Berlin. Her family, her mother and her brother, were murdered in the Holocaust. She somehow survived Theresienstadt. She met someone there. They got married. They went to and they moved to New York. She swore never to return to Germany. She did return at the age of 88 after the death of her husband. And as I said, she carried this torch of teaching the next generation of what happened, became this sort of I don't want to say monument about a person, but definitely became this venerated figure in Germany. She died on May 9th, which I think is interesting, the day after Victory in Europe Day. That must symbolize something. And she was quite a lady. She actually was also, I think, featured, yes, she was featured on the Vogue of Germany, which is also a thing for a woman of that age. I think that also means something and shows how important she was. So I think that she deserves, it is posthumously, but I think she does deserve the Mensch Award.
Very, very much. And as if being on the cover of Vogue is not enough of an honour, a Mensch Award from us. I think we are almost at the end. If you are a subscriber to this podcast, there is extra material, a bonus episode all about Eurovision coming your way.
And we will, Sarah, thank you to Michal Porat, and we shall meet next week.
See you then, Yonit.